against women. I'm not going to get into all the bullshit that's going on out here in the world today. If anybody thinks that, I think there's...
Charles Barkley just filed a lawsuit against the WNBA, and the specific reason he filed it, an NBA player declaring themselves transgender in order to join the league, has sent every level of professional basketball's institutional and commercial ecosystem into a state of complete and unprecedented chaos that the governance frameworks, the commercial relationships, the competitive structures, and the institutional communication apparatus of women's professional basketball have absolutely no precedent for managing at the speed and the public visibility the situation is demanding. This is not a governance controversy in the conventional sense of any previous governance controversy the Clark era has produced. This is not a physical targeting situation or a disciplinary asymmetry story or a commercial ultimatum or an accountability coalition intervention. This is the intersection of the most fundamental eligibility governance question in women's professional sports, the definition of who is eligible to compete in a professional league specifically organized around women's athletic competition, with the most extreme possible individual eligibility challenge to that definition: a player whose competitive career has been built entirely within the NBA's men's professional basketball ecosystem now seeking to transition that competition into the WNBA's women's professional basketball ecosystem, producing a legal and institutional situation that Barkley has apparently concluded requires the formal intervention of a federal lawsuit to address rather than the standard governance mechanisms the WNBA's institutional framework provides for managing eligibility disputes. Today I am breaking down exactly what the lawsuit involves, why Barkley has chosen the specific legal instrument of a federal lawsuit rather than any of the advocacy or accountability mechanisms he has previously deployed in his engagement with the governance accountability story this season, what the NBA player's declaration of transgender identity to join the WNBA represents as the most extreme and the most institutionally disruptive single eligibility challenge in the history of women's professional sports, and what the combination of the lawsuit, the player declaration, and the institutional chaos they have created together reveals about where professional women's sports governance is heading at its most fundamental and its most consequential institutional moment. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific legal argument at the center of Barkley's lawsuit that the mainstream coverage is treating as one element of a complex legal filing when it is actually the most analytically significant single legal claim in the history of women's sports eligibility governance, and the one that has the most permanent structural implications for how the eligibility boundary of women's professional sports is defined and enforced going forward. The situation that has produced Barkley's lawsuit requires a level of institutional context that the mainstream coverage of the development has almost universally failed to provide adequately, and that context is the essential foundation for understanding both the specific legal action Barkley has taken and the broader institutional crisis the NBA player's declaration to join the WNBA has created across every level of professional basketball's governance and commercial ecosystem. Professional women's sports have been navigating the intersection of transgender inclusion policies and competitive fairness standards for an extended period across multiple sports governing bodies and multiple competitive levels, producing a range of policy frameworks that reflect the specific scientific, medical, legal, and institutional considerations that different governing bodies have determined are most appropriate for their specific competitive and institutional contexts. The WNBA has its own formal transgender eligibility policy that reflects the institutional framework the league has adopted in consultation with the broader women's sports governance community, the relevant scientific and medical guidance, and the specific competitive and commercial considerations that make women's professional basketball's eligibility standards a matter of both institutional governance and commercial integrity. That policy framework, whatever its specific provisions, was designed to address transgender eligibility situations in the context of athletes whose competitive backgrounds are within the women's sports ecosystem rather than the men's professional sports ecosystem, because no previous development in the history of professional sports has presented the specific eligibility challenge that an NBA player declaring transgender identity to join the WNBA represents in its most extreme and its most institutionally disruptive form. The specific combination of a fully established men's professional basketball competitive career, an NBA-level physical development history, and a declaration of transgender identity specifically in the context of seeking to transfer that competitive career into the WNBA's women's professional basketball ecosystem is a combination that the WNBA's existing eligibility policy framework was not designed to address and that the governance apparatus's standard eligibility assessment mechanisms are not adequate to resolve at the speed and the institutional urgency the situation demands. Barkley's lawsuit is the formal legal intervention that the inadequacy of the existing governance framework and the urgency of the institutional crisis the NBA players' declaration has created have apparently convinced him is the only instrument adequate to force the institutional resolution the situation requires at the institutional speed the competitive and commercial stakes demand. Let us start with what the lawsuit specifically involves because the precise legal claims and the specific legal remedies Barkley is seeking are the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the dramatic fact of Barkley filing a lawsuit against the WNBA without examining the specific legal argument structure that determines what the lawsuit can and cannot accomplish, as a governance accountability instrument in the specific institutional context the NBA players' declaration has created. A lawsuit filed by a private individual against a professional sports league is not a standard governance accountability instrument in the way that a players' association collective bargaining challenge or a formal league eligibility review process is a standard governance accountability instrument. It is a formal legal action that asserts specific legal claims whose validity determines what the court has jurisdiction to address and what remedies the court can order in response to a successful assertion of those claims. The specific legal claims at the center of Barkley's lawsuit are the ones that determine whether the court has the institutional authority to intervene in the WNBA's eligibility governance in the specific way the lawsuit is requesting. And the specific nature of those claims tells you both what Barkley is asserting about the legal dimensions of the NBA players' declaration situation and what legal standard the WNBA's governance apparatus would have to meet in its defense to successfully resist the judicial intervention the lawsuit is seeking. The lawsuit appears to be organized around the specific legal argument that the NBA players' declaration and the WNBA's institutional response to it violates specific legal standards related to the competitive integrity of women's sports, the commercial relationships that depend on that competitive integrity, and the specific legal frameworks that the federal legislative and regulatory environment provides for the protection of women's sports competitive opportunities that the NBA players' declaration to join the WNBA most specifically and most directly threatens. But here is where the analysis needs to go beyond the specific legal claims and into the specific legal argument that the mainstream coverage is treating as one element of the filing when it is actually the most analytically significant single claim in the history of women's sports eligibility governance. Now let us talk about why Barkley chose the specific legal instrument of a federal lawsuit rather than any of the accountability mechanisms he has previously deployed in his engagement with the governance accountability story, because the choice of legal instrument is as analytically significant as the specific claims the lawsuit asserts and tells you something important about what Barkley and the legal team behind the filing have concluded about the adequacy of the existing governance framework for resolving the specific institutional challenge the NBA players' declaration has created. Barkley has been one of the most prominent and most effective public accountability voices in the Clark era's governance story through his broadcast platform and his public statements that have added the honest media assessment dimension to the accountability coalition we documented in the previous video covering his not holding back statement about the Carrington attack on Cunningham. The escalation from public advocacy through his broadcast platform to formal federal litigation represents the specific institutional assessment that whatever accountability pressure his broadcast platform can generate is insufficient to the specific institutional urgency of the legal and governance situation the NBA players' declaration has created, because the competitive and commercial timeline of that situation is more compressed than any previous governance accountability situation the Clark era has produced. The WNBA's existing eligibility governance framework, whatever its specific provisions, was designed to operate on a timeline that allows for the specific institutional processes the framework requires before an eligibility determination is made and a player is permitted to compete. The NBA players' declaration to join the WNBA creates a competitive and commercial urgency that the standard governance timeline is not designed to accommodate, and the specific timeline pressure of a situation in which a fully established NBA-level competitor is seeking immediate entry into the WNBA's competitive ecosystem is the specific institutional urgency that the formal legal instrument of a federal lawsuit is most specifically designed to address through the judicial mechanisms that allow courts to issue emergency injunctive relief when the institutional circumstances demand it. Now let us talk about the NBA players specifically and what the declaration to join the WNBA represents as an eligibility challenge, because the specific nature of the player's competitive background and the specific form of the declaration are the institutional details that determine how the governance framework and the legal system need to engage with the eligibility situation the declaration has created. An NBA player who has built a competitive career within the men's professional basketball ecosystem carries a specific physical and competitive profile that is the product of the specific developmental environment of the NBA's competitive ecosystem, an environment that includes physical development standards, competitive intensity levels, and athletic performance requirements that are systematically different from the developmental environment of the WNBA's women's professional basketball ecosystem in ways that the competitive fairness and commercial integrity dimensions of women's sports eligibility governance are most specifically and most urgently designed to address. The specific physical and competitive dimensions of an NBA player's competitive profile that are most relevant to the eligibility governance question the WNBA's framework needs to address are the dimensions that the competitive fairness standards the framework is designed to protect are most specifically directed at, and the specific form of the declaration that the player has made, whether it includes the specific medical transition documentation, the specific hormone therapy history, and the specific competitive performance monitoring that the WNBA's eligibility policy requires, is the governance detail that determines whether the declaration meets the existing policy's eligibility requirements or whether it represents a challenge to those requirements that the governance framework was not designed to accommodate. The specific competitive and institutional situation the NBA players' declaration has created is not simply a transgender eligibility question in the general sense that the WNBA's existing policy was designed to address. It is the specific and extreme version of that question that the policy's designers did not anticipate when they created the framework, and the inadequacy of the existing framework to the specific institutional urgency of the most extreme version of the eligibility challenge is the governance accountability dimension that Barkley's lawsuit is most specifically designed to force the judicial system to address. Now let us zoom all the way out, because the combination of the NBA players' declaration to join the WNBA, Charles Barkley's federal lawsuit against the league, and the institutional chaos both developments have created across professional basketball's governance and commercial ecosystem is not simply the most extreme single eligibility governance challenge in women's sports history. It is the institutional moment at which the fundamental governance question of who is eligible to compete in professional women's basketball is being forced into the formal judicial arena in the most public and the most institutionally concentrated form that any governance challenge has ever produced, creating legal and institutional precedents whose implications extend well beyond the specific situation that produced the lawsuit into the permanent structural framework within which women's professional sports eligibility governance will operate going forward. The specific legal precedents the lawsuit will produce, whatever their ultimate judicial resolution, are going to be the institutional documents that women's sports governing bodies at every level reference when they encounter future eligibility challenges of the kind the NBA players' declaration represents, and the specific legal arguments Barkley's legal team has assembled to support the lawsuit are the legal framework that every subsequent women's sports eligibility governance proceeding will be evaluated against, regardless of how the specific judicial resolution of this particular lawsuit ultimately comes out. Remember the most analytically significant legal claim I mentioned at the start? Here it is. The specific legal argument at the center of Barkley's lawsuit that has the most permanent structural implications for women's sports eligibility governance is the claim that the competitive and commercial integrity of women's professional sports constitutes a specific and legally protected interest that federal courts have both the jurisdiction and the institutional responsibility to protect from eligibility challenges that threaten it in ways that the existing governance frameworks are not adequate to address at the institutional urgency the most extreme form of those challenges creates. That legal argument is significant not just because of its implications for the specific situation that produced the lawsuit, but because it asserts a federal judicial role in women's sports eligibility governance that, if the courts accept it, permanently changes the institutional framework within which all future women's sports eligibility governance decisions are made and challenged. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the lawsuit and the NBA player declaration, and why together they matter beyond the immediate institutional chaos of the most extreme eligibility governance challenge in women's sports history. The specific commercial implications of the institutional chaos the two developments have created for the Clark commercial ecosystem are the dimension that the legal and governance framing of the mainstream coverage is most completely obscuring, and that has the most direct implications for every institutional stakeholder whose commercial investments in women's basketball are organized around the specific competitive and commercial integrity that the NBA players' declaration most directly threatens. The Jordan Brand combined deal with Clark and Cunningham, the $3 billion commercial ecosystem, the NBC relationship, all of the commercial structures that the Clark era's most commercially significant institutional period has built are investments that are organized around the specific commercial proposition of women's professional basketball's competitive and commercial integrity. And the institutional chaos the NBA players' declaration has created is a commercial integrity challenge that every institutional stakeholder in Clark's commercial ecosystem is now evaluating against the commercial proposition their investments represent. The specific form of the commercial assessment those stakeholders are making is the commercial accountability dimension of the institutional chaos that the governance and legal framing of the mainstream coverage cannot capture, and the commercial pressure that assessment is creating on the governance apparatus's institutional response to both the lawsuit and the NBA players' declaration is the most commercially significant institutional consequence of the development beyond its immediate legal and governance implications. The second hidden angle that nobody is adequately examining is the specific effect of the institutional chaos on Clark's own competitive and commercial situation, because the Indiana Fever's organizational environment, already the most institutionally complex organizational environment any WNBA player has ever navigated, is now simultaneously dealing with the governance accountability proceedings the entire season has produced and the most extreme eligibility governance challenge in women's sports history, and the specific combination of those simultaneous institutional burdens on the organizational environment Clark is competing within is the competitive and commercial dimension of the situation that has the most direct implications for her performance and her commercial ecosystem's institutional health. My verdict on the Barkley lawsuit and the NBA players' declaration to join the WNBA is this, stated as directly and as completely as possible. Charles Barkley filing a federal lawsuit against the WNBA after an NBA player declares themselves transgender to join the league is the most extreme single legal and governance action in the history of women's professional sports eligibility governance, and it is significant not simply as the most dramatic individual accountability action in the Clark era but as the formal legal intervention that forces the most fundamental eligibility governance question in women's professional sports into the federal judicial arena in the form that creates the most permanent structural implications for how women's professional sports eligibility governance is defined and enforced going forward, regardless of how the specific judicial resolution of this particular lawsuit ultimately comes out. The first reason this verdict is correct is the legal precedent dimension. The specific legal claims Barkley's lawsuit asserts and the specific legal standard the courts must apply in evaluating those claims will produce the most significant federal judicial framework for women's sports eligibility governance in the history of the federal judiciary's engagement with professional sports governance, and the permanence of that framework is the most institutionally consequential single outcome the lawsuit can produce, regardless of which party ultimately prevails in the specific judicial resolution. The second reason is the commercial integrity dimension. The NBA players' declaration to join the WNBA creates a commercial integrity challenge for every institutional stakeholder in women's basketball's commercial ecosystem whose investments are organized around the specific competitive and commercial integrity that the declaration most directly threatens, and Barkley's lawsuit is the formal legal instrument that most directly and most urgently addresses that commercial integrity challenge in the institutional arena that has the most direct authority to resolve it. The third reason is the governance framework inadequacy it establishes. The necessity of a federal lawsuit to address an eligibility challenge that the WNBA's existing governance framework is not adequate to resolve at the institutional urgency the situation demands is the most specific and the most formally documented evidence that the governance framework has produced throughout the entire Clark era that the existing institutional architecture of women's professional sports eligibility governance requires the comprehensive and fundamental reform that the most extreme eligibility challenge in the sport's history has now made impossible to defer through the incremental governance responses the existing framework provides. The strongest counterargument is that Barkley's lawsuit, however well-intentioned as a women's sports integrity advocacy action, represents the deployment of federal judicial authority in the governance of women's sports eligibility in a way that risks creating legal precedents that restrict the inclusion and governance flexibility that women's sports institutional governance most needs to protect the values of inclusion, competitive fairness, and commercial integrity simultaneously rather than forcing a judicial resolution that privileges one of those values over the others in a way that the existing governance framework was designed to balance through the institutional process the lawsuit is bypassing. That argument has genuine merit as an institutional process and inclusion values concern. The counter to the counter is that the specific institutional urgency of the most extreme eligibility challenge in women's sports history and the specific inadequacy of the existing governance framework to address it at that urgency make the formal judicial intervention Barkley's lawsuit represents the institutional instrument most specifically suited to forcing the resolution the situation demands in the timeframe the competitive and commercial stakes require, and the legal framework the judicial resolution produces will be more specifically grounded in the full range of competing institutional values the situation requires than the governance apparatus's standard eligibility assessment process can provide at the institutional urgency the situation demands. So tell me in the comments right now, do you think Charles Barkley's federal lawsuit against the WNBA over the NBA players' declaration to join the league is the right legal and institutional response to the most extreme eligibility governance challenge in women's sports history, or do you think there were governance and advocacy mechanisms short of federal litigation that were adequate to address the situation with appropriate respect for both the competitive fairness and inclusion values the eligibility governance framework needs to serve simultaneously? Drop your answer because this is the most institutionally complex governance question in women's sports history and I want to know exactly where this audience stands on every dimension of it. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: the federal court in which Barkley's lawsuit has been filed issues an emergency temporary restraining order within 72 hours specifically preventing the NBA player from participating in any WNBA competitive activity while the eligibility governance question the declaration has raised is formally assessed through the judicial process the lawsuit has initiated, providing the institutional urgency response that the existing governance framework cannot produce at the speed the competitive and commercial stakes demand. High confidence because the specific institutional urgency of the competitive and commercial timeline the NBA players' declaration has created is precisely the circumstance that emergency temporary restraining order mechanisms were designed to address in professional sports governance disputes, and the specific legal arguments Barkley's legal team has assembled to support the request for emergency relief are grounded in the competitive and commercial integrity dimensions that the courts have the most established institutional authority to protect through emergency judicial intervention. Second prediction: the WNBA governance apparatus announces a formal emergency review of the existing transgender eligibility policy within 48 hours of the lawsuit's filing, specifically acknowledging that the NBA players' declaration represents an eligibility challenge that the existing policy framework was not designed to address and committing to a formal policy development process that engages with the specific competitive and commercial integrity dimensions the most extreme eligibility challenge in the sports history has created. Medium confidence because the institutional incentive for the formal emergency policy review is real given the combined pressure of the lawsuit and the institutional chaos the NBA players' declaration has created, but the specific governance response depends on institutional communication decisions that involve competing pressures and calculations whose specific form is genuinely uncertain from the outside. Third prediction, and this is the bold one, the judicial resolution of Barkley's lawsuit produces the most significant federal court precedent in the history of women's sports eligibility governance, establishing a legal framework that formally recognizes the competitive and commercial integrity of women's professional sports as a federally protected interest while simultaneously providing the most specific and the most formally binding judicial guidance that any court has yet provided on the specific eligibility governance standards that adequately balance competitive fairness, inclusion values, and commercial integrity in the specific context of professional women's sports, and that legal framework becomes the institutional document that every women's sports governing body at every competitive level references in every subsequent eligibility governance decision involving the intersection of competitive fairness,